American Constitution is the supreme law of the United States of America since 1789. It provides the framework for the organization of the United States government. The document outlines the three main branches of the government: the legislative branch with a bicameral Congress, an executive branch led by the President, and a judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court. Besides providing for the organization of these branches, the Constitution also outlines the powers each branch may exercise and reserves numerous rights for the individual states. But let us go back a little and see what went into the making of the American Constitution. Between 1775 and 1783, the 13 colonies of America united against the British Empire and entered into an armed conflict known as the American War of Independence. In fact, the Revolutionary era began long before, sometime in 1763, when the French military threat to British North American colonies ended. Adopting the view that the colonies should pay a substantial portion of the costs associated with keeping them in the empire, Britain imposed a series of taxes, followed by other laws that proved extremely unpopular. Since the colonies lacked elected representation in the governing British Parliament, many colonists considered the laws to be illegitimate and a violation of their rights as Englishmen. This resulted in an American Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the victory over the British on the battlefield of Yorktown in October 1781. The long War of Independence finally ended on the 3rd of September 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed and Britain formally recognized the United States as an independent nation.
Independence was a time for elation, but it was also a time of great insecurity. 20% of the population of the 13 colonies emigrated over the course of the last years of the War of Independence. Most of these had come from the classes that had dealt with administration, finance, and trade. Very few had actually been ordinary farmers. The consequence of this was an enormous gap as far as administrative expertise and financial expertise was concerned in colonies which really needed these talents. Hence, one can say straight away that there was a major source of instability built into American government in each of the colonies at the time of the formation of the Confederation. Second, in almost all colonies, there had been tremendous passions which had been thrown up by the American War of Independence. Americans had fought Americans. It is frequently forgotten that the Revolutionary War was also a civil war, that loyalists had fought against revolutionaries, that Indians had been massacred by the revolutionaries in constituting a new state, that there had been uncertainties about the loyalties as well as importance to utilize black members of American society in the cause of freedom. There had therefore been great passion, great rivalry, and great upset in society that the war had engendered. This would not die away simply because the British left. So these 2 points have to be remembered when we think of the state of affairs in the year 1783 and the terms of the Peace of Paris. Beyond this, Americans themselves feared for their future. The British were still in charge in Canada. The Spanish dominated the Western Territories and the South, and even if they were friends, the French dominated in a very large territory linked to Louisiana. The citizens of the 13 colonies were therefore apparently, both territorially and perhaps even in number, a minority on the North American continent. This led to a degree of uncertainty concerning their geopolitical future.
Well, initially there was a lot of fear because there's a collapse of an old order. There was anarchy everywhere. The states got back their pre-charter liberties, no doubt, but they didn't know what to do with this liberty. There was the problem of law and order. Then there was the disbanding of the Revolutionary Army, and the British Army was on the retreat. All on a sudden, the continental currency was withdrawn, and there was some kind of a financial limbo for the country. They didn't know what was their legal tender, how to trade with the neighboring state. This was a chronic problem. Then many of the states were afraid of the British vendetta after the revolution. So they needed some kind of a rearguard action. The problem of the disposal of the West. There's a scramble for moving to the West and gaining more territory. And there's a fight between state and state who had a western Wild West frontier for them. Over river navigation like Potomac, Virginia and Maryland fought bitterly. So these problems were there, the immediate problems were actually there, which couldn't be solved by the states on their own. And because of this kind of anarchy, naturally they thought that they had to come to a convention where they could have some kind of a constitution.
So the representatives from the states met at Philadelphia in 1781. At first, none of the states wanted a strong central government. Great Britain had ruled them as colonies, something that they were not happy with. So they opted to ratify the Articles of Confederation, which was proposed at the Second Continental Congress in 1775. The ratified Article of Confederation became the first Constitution of America, and it had legally united the states by compact into the United States of America as a union with a confederation government. But eventually, the Articles of Confederation caused deep division among the states, which the national government could not resolve.
That basic fight between federal rights and state rights and individual rights, that loomed large in the debate. There was no solution on the horizon. Particularly, we find that minimum right was to be granted to a federal center if it was created at the Confederate Convention. They would only give, the states would only give two powers to the center that would be created. One was defense against enemy, and the other was foreign policy. These two areas were to be given to the center, but all other things were retained by the states. They would not part with their fiscal autonomy nor their political autonomy of any kind. Still, there was a very heavy premium on state rights. The spirit of adjustment, the spirit of compromise had not come as yet. This was the situation. And therefore, once again, from 1781 to 87, the American colonies, they were in a disparate situation. They were on their parallel lines. They never converged on certain basic ethics of government. That was the problem. And therefore, after some time, they realized that this was not going to be the permanent solution. Articles of Confederation was not going to be a permanent solution because problems were not resolved of any kind. And therefore, the danger from abroad, particularly from Britain or Spain, remained very much in the background. Along with that, trade almost came to a standstill because there's no power value fixed for the various currencies operating in the different states. And as yet, no standard US dollar had been evolved. So there was this crisis. Trade was hampered. And without peace and commerce, the nation couldn't progress. So whatever the way, they had to come back again to the conference table. They had to come back.
The Annapolis Convention was held prior to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, where Maryland and Virginia dissolved the dispute over the navigation of the river Potomac.
Shays' Rebellion was an incident which took place in 1786 in western Massachusetts, where the leader of the militia of the area, Daniel Shays, together with a number of farmers, prevented the functioning of courts and also attempted to seize a federal arsenal. The importance of the rebellion was twofold. First and foremost, the rebellion itself indicated the weakness of the entire financial policy of the state of Massachusetts. There was a lack of money supply within the state, and this itself had led to lack of funds on amongst the farmers and their inability to pay off their debts. The second aspect of the incident, which was important and which was a cause for worry, was that Shays himself was, after all, a member of the militia. A person who was himself charged with the task of upholding law and order was deciding to defy authorities. This did not forebode anything good for the future of a state, the state of Massachusetts, which was one of the best governed amongst the 13 colonies. Bearing these particular points in mind, many of those who went to Philadelphia would recast perhaps in their mind the slogan that Shays himself used, "United we stand, divided we die," to think of their own future.
At this time, George Washington very wisely remarked, "The states were united as if by a rope of sand." And he also pointed out that the machinery of government was clogged because the states couldn't agree with each other on many questions.
Very rightly so. They gradually realized from 1781 to 1787, in these years, they learned to respect each other's rights, learn to sacrifice for the cause of the nation. If the nation was to be strong, a federal constitution was necessary. A strong center to be created. Alexander Hamilton, in his complimentary papers, have been repeatedly saying that a strong center had to be created. There was no other alternative to strong center. Perhaps his prescription was too strong for the states to consume. That is true. He wanted virtually a unitary kind of constitution, like in England, which country he admired very much. But that was not also practicable. But nevertheless, the campaign was on that the state rights had to be sacrificed for the cause of federal rights. A strong center had to be created, uniform currency had to be evolved, uniform foreign policy had to be made, uniform policy of disposal of the West had to be made. So these are outstanding questions which had to be solved. And therefore, 1781 was no solution.
On the 21st of January 1786, the Virginia legislature, following James Madison's recommendation, invited all the states to Annapolis, Maryland, to discuss the defects of the federal government and suggest the remedy to reduce interstate conflicts between the largely independent states under the Articles of Confederation. The convention met from the 11th to the 14th of September 1786. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island and North Carolina had appointed commissioners who failed to get to the meeting in time to attend it, while Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina and Georgia had taken no action at all. The commissioners felt that there were not enough states represented to make any substantive agreement. Thus, they produced a report which was sent to the Congress and to the states. The direct result of the report was the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. The Federal Convention was convened in the State House in Philadelphia on the 14th of May 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. Because the delegations from only 2 states were present at first, the members adjourned every day until a quorum of 7 states was obtained on the 25th of May.
We know from the contemporary accounts that some states had sent 5-member team, some states had sent 3 members from their state, some even had sent only 2. So they were uneven representations, no doubt.
Well-known American leaders such as James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, and Benjamin Franklin took part in the Federal Convention. George Washington was elected President of the Convention. John Adams, who eventually became the 2nd President of the United States, did not go to the meeting. He was in England serving as the U.S. Ambassador. Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, wasn't there either. He was in France as the U.S. Ambassador. But they wrote encouraging notes to the delegates. Patrick Henry, a famous speaker from Virginia, refused to attend. He did not like the idea of this meeting, saying he smelled a rat. He was against the idea of a strong central government.
So we can say that a galaxy of intellectuals had come, mostly statesmen and lawyers had come, some merchants had come, but not the rabble, not the crowd as such. But they didn't mind. They thought that they have been well represented in the Philadelphia Convention of 1787.
Through discussion and debate, it became clear by mid-June that rather than amending the existing articles, the convention would draft an entirely new frame of government. It was summer. The heat in Philadelphia was terrible. In closed sessions, the 55 delegates, most of the outstanding leaders of the new nation, known as the Founding Fathers, debated and redrafted the articles of the new Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, who was in France during the convention, characterized the delegates as an assembly of demigods.
And in this convention, the first issue that was decided was that the states would have equal representation in the Senate. But in the House of Representatives, there would be proportional representation according to the size of the population of a particular state. If a state like Massachusetts was very big, it would have more representatives. If Maryland was small, it would have less. So this was the idea, and this was accepted by all. All of them accepted. And this question of having a unitary kind of constitution, which was tabled by Alexander Hamilton, was outright rejected, because still that fight was on between federal rights and state rights. They wanted to create a strong center at this time in 1787, but never by sacrificing all state rights and making the government unitary. It was still a federal constitution. Federal rights were minimal, and state rights still were held to be sacrosanct. And now the change was that foreign policy and defense was still with the federal government. There was no quarrel about that. Disposal of the West also left to the federal government. Coin and currency also left to the federal government. These are all allowed. But then lot of political autonomy and fiscal autonomy was still retained. Right to taxation and legislation were also reserved for the states by themselves. They were not absolutely governed by the federal legislation all the time. They were doing all these things, sacrificing all their rights because of the creating a new nation. As Merrill Jensen has called his book New Nation, that is the best book to read on these early stages of American history. And he has asserted that the good spirit, that was beau ideal, as we say, that was very much, that permeated the minds of all members. So that was also there. That point is well taken. That is also there. And the spirit of sacrifice comes from their deep sense of freedom. They had that kind of idealism in them. They were not really doing only realpolitik. They had that idealism left in them. So we can say that realpolitik was there, accommodation of state rights was there, accommodation of concession to federal right was also there, and enshrining the natural rights, inalienable natural rights of man was also enshrined in the Constitution. So nobody was all three parties were not sacrificed. It's a wonderful texture of the Constitution, and hats off to James Madison who drafted it. So James Madison drafted the Constitution, which was of course amended by Alexander Hamilton here and there, Thomas Jefferson here and there, and Washington and Benjamin Franklin, who would say that they vetted the Constitution. They also approved, and only then it was through. Otherwise it wouldn't be accepted. It's a wonderful piece of document. It is now followed in many countries, including India, the way the Constitution was framed. The federal government was something like a federal constitution that we have in India. There was central list of power, there was state list of power, other concurrent list of power. I pass on to the last section. This section is on the character of the Constitution. Charles Beard wrote his monumental work, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. In that work, this economic historian, who is supposed to be also a Marxist, pointed out that the Constitution was basically an economic document, not a political document of consensus. He said in his book that the composition of the Philadelphia Convention was so master-minded that only the merchant class and the lawyer classes were represented. Ordinary people had no berth in the Philadelphia Convention. Though there were people like Tom Paine or Sam Adams, radical people like them, somehow Patrick Henry, these people didn't have their way to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787 because they were radicals. Only, I wouldn't say strictly conservatives, but liberals got entry, and mostly the lawyers, they got entry. And naturally, from the very beginning, it was so managed in the states that only the people who would accept the federal constitution were chosen. They came. Therefore, right from the beginning, we can say at the nursery stage, opposition was eliminated, and agreeing people came together, and therefore it became a knife through butter, very smooth going, and therefore hardly there was much debate over the provisions. It was decided that there will be some rights which will be state rights, like the political autonomy, taxation legislation for the states for their own territory was to be granted, that the federal taxation would also be allowed, that federal tariff would be allowed, the Bank of United States would be allowed. These things were also taken for granted. This would happen. Foreign policy and disposal of the West would be left in the hands of the federal government. This was also allowed. Therefore, there was not much of a hassle. And as I have already said in the earlier part, that it was a mood of picnic. people were coming in and going out at any stage of the debate. There was not much of a fight. Against this opinion, we have the historian Robert Eric Brown, who wrote the other book on the Constitution of the United States. He says that it would be too much to say that it was an engineered document. It would be too much to say that personality people prevailed over the reality people. He says by count also the number would be 50-50. It's not that personality people are more. In fact, he says that personality people would be hardly 33% out of the 55 delegates who had come. Rest would be reality people and ordinary people. So from that point of view, he says that class conflict cannot be an issue here. There is no class conflict. It's more of a consensus among different heterogeneous people, not belong to a particular class like personality. You cannot label them like that. And a lot of friends were there who belonged to personality but supported reality. There are a lot of people who are in the reality block but supported personality issues. Therefore, the class line cannot be drawn here. Beard had overdone his trick. That was he says, a doctored kind of thesis. Reality was that the document was a universal national document. All kinds of people actually accepted it for their own good. They understood that there had to be an umpire in the battle of the states. A federal government had to be created, and so that government came. So Brown is in favor of calling it a national document rather than an economic document. A universal document where all people agreed to accept this kind of constitution, no matter whether they came to the convention or not. Even outside, when the constitution was passed, there was jubilation all over the United States. All kinds of people actually rejoiced that this kind of a constitution had ultimately been passed to the benefit of the entire nation. If you ask my personal opinion on this question, I would say it is a very, very elitist document. It is not, strictly speaking, an economic document as Beard wanted to prove, nor strictly speaking a national document as Brown wanted to prove. I would say it's my qualification that it is a bourgeois document.
The Constitution of America is the work of many minds. Today it stands as a model of cooperative statesmanship and the art of compromise. The 55 men who created the Constitution laid the framework for what was to become the greatest and most powerful nation in the world, the United States of America.